The doll was supposed to be a gift for my daughter's 8th birthday, but instead it became the gateway through which something ancient and evil entered our home. What I'm about to tell you will make you think twice about every antique you've ever brought into your house. Because some objects carry more than just memories, they carry the souls of the damned. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt an immediate sense of dread when looking at an old toy, because that instinct might have saved you from the nightmare my family endured. My name is Jennifer, and until 3 months ago, I was a skeptic when it came to the supernatural. I worked as a marketing manager for a tech company in Hartford, Connecticut, lived in a comfortable suburban home with my husband Mark and our daughter Sophie, and believed that ghost stories were just entertainment for people who needed more excitement in their lives. I was wrong about everything. The nightmare began at the Whitmore estate sale in late August. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had passed away at 93, leaving behind a magnificent Victorian mansion filled with over 7 decades of collected antiques. The sale was advertised as a collector's dream: original furniture, vintage clothing, rare books, and what the listing described as an exceptional collection of period toys and dolls. Sophie had been begging for months for a fancy old doll, like the ones she'd seen in movies about rich families from long ago. She was fascinated by the idea of having something that had belonged to children from another era, something with its own history and story. As we walked through the estate sale that sunny Saturday morning, I figured this would be the perfect place to find her something special. Hit the like button if you can already sense where this story is heading, because sometimes our children's innocent wishes open doors we never meant to unlock. The Whitmore mansion was exactly what you'd expect from a century-old family estate. High ceilings, ornate molding, and room after room filled with treasures that spoke of wealth and refined taste. Mrs. Whitmore had been a collector of fine things, and every surface was covered with carefully preserved artifacts from bygone eras. The doll collection was displayed in what had once been a child's nursery on the 2nd floor. Dozens of vintage dolls sat on shelves and in display cases: baby dolls, fashion dolls, and elaborate porcelain figures in period clothing. Most were beautiful but clearly showed their age, with faded dresses, thinning hair, or small chips in their painted faces. But one doll stood apart from the rest. She sat alone in a glass display case in the corner of the room, and the moment I saw her, I understood why she warranted special treatment. This doll was absolutely perfect. Porcelain skin without a single crack or blemish, glossy auburn hair that looked freshly styled, and the most realistic glass eyes I'd ever seen on a vintage toy. Her dress was exquisite, deep blue velvet with intricate beadwork, obviously handmade and perfectly preserved. "That's Evangeline," said the elderly woman running the estate sale, noticing my interest. "She's the crown jewel of Mrs. Whitmore's collection. Dates back to 1924, made by the famous doll maker Hermann Steiner in Germany. Everything original. The hair is real human hair. The dress was hand-sewn by a seamstress in Paris. And those eyes, well, they're special." "Special how?" I asked, leaning closer to examine the doll. "They're made from actual blown glass, not the cheaper materials most doll manufacturers used. Look closely. You can see the depth in them, almost like real eyes." She was right. Evangeline's eyes had an unsettling realism that made it seem like she was actually looking at you. As I studied her face, I could have sworn I saw her eyelids flutter. But that was obviously just a trick of the light filtering through the lace curtains. "How much?" I asked. The woman hesitated. "Well, she's priced at $800. She's quite valuable, you understand, but..." She glanced around to make sure no one else was listening, then lowered her voice. "Mrs. Whitmore specifically requested that Evangeline go to a family with children. She always said the doll missed being played with. So if you're buying her for your daughter, I could let her go for $400. $400 was more than I'd planned to spend, but looking at Evangeline, I knew Sophie would be thrilled. This wasn't just a doll. This was a piece of history, a work of art that happened to be shaped like a toy. "I'll take her," I said. Comment below what you think I should have done differently, because even now, I wonder if there were warning signs I chose to ignore. The woman carefully lifted Evangeline from her display case, and I noticed how she handled the doll. Gently, but with a certain tension in her movements, as if she was relieved to be letting her go. She wrapped Evangeline in tissue paper and placed her in a sturdy box, then handed me a manila envelope. "Mrs. Whitmore left this with specific instructions that it should go to whoever bought Evangeline," she explained. She said it contained important information about the doll's care and history. I tucked the envelope into my purse, paid for the doll, and headed home with what I thought was the perfect birthday gift for Sophie. Mark helped me carry the box upstairs to Sophie's room, where we planned to surprise her after school. "This thing is heavier than I expected," Mark commented as we set the box on Sophie's bed. "What's it made of, Lead?" I laughed and opened the box, carefully lifting away the tissue paper to reveal Evangeline. In the afternoon light streaming through Sophie's bedroom window, the doll looked even more beautiful than she had at the estate sale. Her porcelain skin seemed to glow with inner light, and her glass eyes sparkled with lifelike brilliance. "Wow," Mark said, clearly impressed. "Sophie's going to love her. She looks almost real." "I know, right? Look at the detail in her dress and that hair. It's actual human hair from the 1920s. Mark reached out to touch the doll's face, then pulled his hand back abruptly. "Geez, she's cold. Like really cold." I touched Evangeline's cheek and felt the same thing, an unnatural chill that seemed to radiate from deep within the porcelain. Probably just from sitting in that air-conditioned estate sale all day, I reasoned, though something about the temperature felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. We decided to leave Evangeline sitting on Sophie's dresser as a surprise. I placed her carefully among Sophie's other toys and books, making sure she was positioned where Sophie would see her immediately upon entering the room. "She fits right in," Mark observed, and he was right. Evangeline looked perfectly at home in our daughter's room, as if she'd always belonged there. That evening, Sophie's reaction was everything I'd hoped for. She walked into her room after dinner, spotted Evangeline immediately, and let out a squeal of pure delight. "Is she mine? Really mine?" Sophie asked, rushing to the dresser to get a closer look. "Happy early birthday, sweetheart," I said. "Her name is Evangeline, and she's very special. She's almost 100 years old." Sophie's eyes went wide. "She's older than great-grandma was. Much older. She belonged to children who lived a long, long time ago. Now she's yours to take care of." Sophie carefully lifted Evangeline from the dresser, cradling her like a real baby. "She's so pretty," she whispered, "and her eyes are so blue, they look just like real eyes." "They're made of special glass," I explained. "That's why they look so realistic." Sophie spent the next hour introducing Evangeline to her other dolls and stuffed animals, setting up an elaborate tea party and chattering away as if the vintage doll could hear every word. It was exactly the kind of imaginative play I'd hoped to encourage, and seeing Sophie so happy made the $400 price tag feel worthwhile. That night, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she insisted that Evangeline sleep on the pillow next to her. "She told me she gets scared sleeping alone," Sophie explained matter-of-factly. "Oh, she did?" I smiled at my daughter's imagination. "And how did she tell you that?" "She didn't say it with words. She told me with her eyes. They looked sad when I put her back on the dresser." Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because what happened over the next few days taught me that children sometimes see truths that adults refuse to acknowledge. I should have paid more attention to Sophie's comment about Evangeline's eyes, because over the next week I began to notice things about the doll that made me increasingly uncomfortable. It started with her position. Every morning, I would find Evangeline sitting in a slightly different spot than where Sophie had left her the night before. At first, I assumed Sophie was getting up during the night to play. But when I asked her about it, she seemed genuinely confused. "I always put her right next to my pillow," Sophie insisted, "but when I wake up, she's looking at different parts of my room." "What do you mean, looking at different parts of your room?" "Her head is turned toward my closet, or toward the door, or toward the window, like she's watching different things at night." I told myself that Sophie was probably moving the doll unconsciously in her sleep, or that the old porcelain head might be loose and shifting on its own. Vintage dolls weren't known for their structural integrity after all, but then I started noticing the temperature changes. Whenever I entered Sophie's room, there was a distinct cold spot near wherever Evangeline happened to be sitting. Not just the coolness I'd noticed when we first brought her home, but a genuine chill that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire area around the doll by at least 10 degrees. Even Mark commented on it. "Is there a draft in here?" he asked one evening as we said goodnight to Sophie. "It's freezing near her dresser." I checked the windows, the heating vents, even the electrical outlets, looking for any source of cold air. There was nothing. The chill seemed to emanate directly from Evangeline herself. Then there were the sounds. It started as soft, scratching noises coming from Sophie's room in the middle of the night. Gentle, rhythmic sounds like fingernails tapping against wood. The first few times, I assumed it was tree branches scraping against the house in the wind, but the sounds continued even on perfectly still nights. One night, around 2 a.m., I decided to investigate. I crept quietly down the hallway and pressed my ear to Sophie's bedroom door. The scratching was definitely coming from inside the room, and it had a deliberate, purposeful quality that made my skin crawl. I eased the door open just enough to peek inside. Sophie was fast asleep, but Evangeline was sitting upright on the bed beside her, positioned as if she was watching Sophie sleep. The scratching sound was coming from the doll's direction, though in the dim light I couldn't see what might be causing it. As I watched, Evangeline's head turned slowly toward the door, toward me. Hit the like button if this story is already terrifying you, because what I saw in that doll's glass eyes made me realize we were dealing with something far beyond a simple antique. Those glass eyes, which had looked so beautiful and lifelike during the day, now seemed to glow with their own internal light. But more disturbing than the glow was the intelligence I saw there. This wasn't the blank stare of a lifeless toy. This was the focused, aware gaze of something that was very much alive and very much watching me. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into Evangeline's eyes, and I swear I could feel her looking back. Not just seeing me, but studying me, evaluating me, deciding what she thought of me. The scratching sound stopped abruptly, as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, and then I quietly closed the door and retreated to my bedroom. I spent the rest of the night lying awake, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that stress or lack of sleep had made me see things that weren't there, but I knew what I'd seen. Evangeline was aware, and she was watching my family. The next morning, I remembered the manila envelope the estate sale woman had given me, the one containing important information about the doll's care and history. I'd completely forgotten about it in the excitement of Sophie's reaction to her gift. I found the envelope in my purse and opened it in my kitchen while Sophie was at school and Mark was at work. Inside were several sheets of aged paper covered in elegant handwriting, along with what appeared to be photocopies of old newspaper clippings. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Mrs. Whitmore's death. "To whoever purchases Evangeline, I'm writing this because I cannot in good conscience pass this doll to another family without explaining what you are inheriting. Evangeline is not simply an antique toy. She is something far more complex and dangerous, and I am deeply sorry that I do not have the strength to deal with her properly before my passing. Evangeline came into my family's possession in 1953, when my husband purchased her from another estate sale. The previous owner, a woman named Margaret Thorne, had tried to warn us about the doll's nature, but we dismissed her concerns as superstition. We were young and rational, and we wanted a beautiful antique for our daughter's nursery. Within a week of bringing Evangeline home, our daughter Clara began experiencing nightmares. She claimed that the doll would move around her room at night, watching her sleep and whispering things in a language she didn't understand. We assumed she was having normal childhood fears about a new toy, but then other things began to happen. Objects in Clara's room would be rearranged overnight. The temperature around the doll would drop dramatically for no reason. Most disturbing of all, Clara began to change. She became secretive, aggressive, and would have long conversations with Evangeline that seemed far too sophisticated for a 7-year-old child. We eventually realized that Evangeline was not simply haunted. She was possessed by something that was influencing our daughter. The entity inhabiting the doll was teaching Clara things no child should know, filling her mind with dark knowledge and ancient hatred. I have spent the last 70 years learning to manage Evangeline's presence. There are rules that must be followed, precautions that must be taken, and warning signs that must never be ignored. I have included all of this information in the attached pages, though I pray you will never need to use it. Please understand, Evangeline cannot be simply thrown away or destroyed. We have tried. The entity that inhabits her is bound to the physical form, but it is also bound to whoever possesses her. If you try to get rid of her, she will find her way back, and her anger at being rejected will make her far more dangerous than she is when properly managed. I am passing this burden to you because I have no choice. I am dying, and Evangeline must go somewhere. But please, I beg you, read the attached information carefully. Follow the rules exactly, and if you have children, watch them closely for the warning signs I have documented. May God forgive me for what I am leaving you to deal with. Eleanor Whitmore. Share your own haunted object experiences in the comments section, because what I read in Mrs. Whitmore's detailed instructions made me realize my family was in more danger than I'd ever imagined. With shaking hands, I turned to the additional pages Mrs. Whitmore had included. They were covered in meticulous notes, observations, and rules that had apparently been refined over 7 decades of living with Evangeline. Rules for managing Evangeline's presence. 1. Never leave her alone with children for extended periods. The entity becomes more active and influential when adults are not present to maintain boundaries. 2. Do not allow her to be moved from room to room frequently. She becomes territorial and aggressive when her environment is constantly changed. 3. Watch for temperature drops around the doll. Sudden, extreme cold indicates increased supernatural activity and should be treated as a warning. 4. Listen for sounds that have no physical source. Tapping, scratching, whispers. These are attempts by the entity to communicate or establish dominance. 5. Most importantly, if a child begins having conversations with Evangeline that seem too mature or sophisticated, intervene immediately. The entity shares knowledge that children should not possess, and this sharing creates a dangerous psychic bond. Warning signs in children. Advanced vocabulary appearing suddenly. Knowledge of historical events or people they have never learned about. Aggressive or manipulative behavior that is out of character. Complaints about nightmares involving the lady in the mirror or the woman with no face. Secretive behavior, especially involving the doll. Temperature sensitivity, feeling cold when others feel warm. Claims that the doll is teaching them things. I read through page after page of Mrs. Whitmore's observations, and with growing horror, I realized that Sophie was already exhibiting several of the warning signs. Just yesterday, she had used the word melancholy to describe how Evangeline was feeling, a vocabulary word I was certain she'd never encountered before. 2 days ago, she'd asked me who the lady with the burned face was, claiming that Evangeline had told her about someone with that description. And Sophie had been complaining about being cold constantly, even when the house felt perfectly warm to Mark and me. The entity inhabiting Evangeline was already beginning to influence my daughter. I kept reading, looking for solutions, for ways to break whatever connection was forming between Sophie and the doll. Mrs. Whitmore's notes included several attempts she'd made over the years to rid herself of Evangeline, all of which had failed spectacularly. 1961, attempted to donate Evangeline to local church. Doll appeared in Clara's room the next morning. Father McKenna reported strange occurrences at church for weeks afterward. 1968, buried Evangeline in backyard during Clara's absence at summer camp. Clara became violently ill within hours, claiming she could feel the doll suffocating underground. Had to dig her up to restore Clara's health. 1975, tried to have Evangeline exorcised by Catholic priest. During the ritual, all mirrors in house shattered simultaneously. Priest reported seeing the face of a woman in great agony in the broken glass before fleeing the house. 1982, attempted to burn Evangeline in fireplace. Doll would not ignite despite intense heat. Fire mysteriously extinguished itself whenever flames touched the doll's dress. 1995, took Evangeline to paranormal investigator Dr. James Hartley. Dr. Hartley identified the entity as the spirit of Margaret Bellwether, a doll maker's daughter who died in 1924. However, attempts to communicate with or release the spirit resulted in poltergeist activity that lasted for months. Each failed attempt was followed by escalated supernatural activity and increased danger to Mrs. Whitmore's family. The message was clear. Evangeline could not be easily disposed of, and trying to force her removal would only make the situation worse. But the most chilling part of Mrs. Whitmore's notes was her description of what happened when the entity's influence over a child became too strong. The bonding process. If allowed to proceed unchecked, the entity will form a permanent psychic bond with a child host. This process appears to occur in stages. Stage 1, days 1 to 14. Initial contact. Child reports doll talking to them, usually through telepathic communication. Temperature anomalies and minor object displacement occur. Stage 2, days 15 to 30. Knowledge transfer. Entity begins sharing information with child, historical facts, adult concepts, languages the child has never learned. Child's personality begins to shift. Stage 3, days 31 to 45. Behavioral changes. Child becomes secretive, manipulative, sometimes aggressive, may claim to remember things from before they were born. Physical symptoms include unexplained bruises, scratch marks, temperature sensitivity. Stage 4, days 46-60, possession attempts. Entity begins trying to take control of child's body for short periods. Child may speak in different voices, display knowledge or skills they've never learned, or have periods of lost time they cannot remember. Stage 5, beyond day 60. Complete bonding. Child's personality becomes merged with the entity. Original child consciousness is suppressed or destroyed. Physical body continues to function, but is controlled by the ancient spirit inhabiting the doll. Clara reached stage 4 before we realized what was happening. Only constant vigilance and the intervention of Dr. Hartley prevented complete possession. Even so, Clara was never quite the same afterward. She retained some of the entity's memories and knowledge for the rest of her life. I looked at the calendar on my kitchen wall. We'd had Evangeline for exactly 12 days. According to Mrs. Whitmore's timeline, Sophie was entering the most dangerous phase of the bonding process. Let me know if you want me to investigate this further, because what happened when Sophie came home from school that day proved that we were running out of time to save her. Sophie's backpack hit the kitchen floor with unusual force, and when I looked up from Mrs. Whitmore's notes, I saw my daughter standing in the doorway with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It was knowing, calculating, and far too mature for an 8-year-old. "Hello, Mother," Sophie said in a voice that was hers but somehow different, more formal, with careful pronunciation that seemed to come from another era entirely. "I trust you've had an educational afternoon." My blood turned to ice. Sophie never called me Mother. She had called me Mom or Mama since she'd started talking, and the way she was speaking now, with that odd, old-fashioned formality, was exactly what Mrs. Whitmore had warned about. "Sophie, are you feeling okay, sweetie?" She tilted her head in a way that reminded me sickeningly of a bird studying potential prey. "I feel quite well, thank you. Though I must say, I'm rather disappointed that you've been reading about dear Evangeline without inviting me to participate in the discussion. She couldn't have known about the letters. I'd been reading them in the kitchen while she was at school, and the papers were still spread across the table where she couldn't see them from the doorway." "How do you know what I was reading?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sophie's smile was not the innocent grin of a child. It was cold, knowing, and filled with a satisfaction that made my skin crawl. "Evangeline tells me many things, Mother. She's been watching over our family very carefully since she joined us. She's particularly interested in you. Sophie, where did you learn to talk like that? That's not how you usually speak, isn't it?" She walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a juice box, but her movements were different too. More controlled, more deliberate, like someone much older inhabiting a child's body. "Perhaps you simply haven't been paying attention. Children learn so many new things when they have the right teacher." I gathered Mrs. Whitmore's papers together, folding them quickly and stuffing them back into the envelope. Sophie watched my movements with unsettling intensity. "You needn't hide those," she said conversationally. "I already know everything Eleanor wrote about our family's history. Evangeline remembers Clara quite fondly. She says Clara was an excellent student, very receptive to learning about the old ways." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sophie was speaking as if she had personal knowledge of events that had happened decades before she was born, using vocabulary and concepts that no 8-year-old should understand. "Sophie, I want you to go upstairs and play in the living room for a while. Don't go into your bedroom." Her expression hardened. "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mother. Evangeline is expecting me. We have so much more to discuss today. Did you know that she remembers being alive? She remembers what it felt like to have a real body before the accident." "What accident?" Sophie's eyes gleamed with knowledge she had no right to possess. "The fire, of course. The dollmaker's workshop burned down in 1924, and poor Margaret was trapped inside. She died screaming, clutching the doll she'd been working on, the doll that would become her new home." Such a tragic story, don't you think? I had never told Sophie anything about the doll's history, and Mrs. Whitmore's notes had mentioned that the entity was identified as Margaret Bellwether, a dollmaker's daughter who died in 1924. There was no way Sophie could have known these details unless something was feeding her information directly. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because what Sophie said next confirmed my worst fears about how far the possession had already progressed. "She's teaching me so many fascinating things," Sophie continued, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that was somehow more disturbing than her earlier formality. "Did you know that people taste different depending on how they die? Margaret learned that during the fire. She's going to teach me how to taste emotions, how to feed on fear and sadness the way she does. The juice box in Sophie's hand began to frost over, ice crystals forming on the outside despite the warm temperature of the kitchen. Her breath was becoming visible in small puffs, as if she was standing in a freezer. "Sophie, you're scaring Mommy. This isn't how you normally talk." "Oh, but Mother," she said with that terrible adult smile, "this is how I've always wanted to talk. Margaret says I was holding myself back before, trying to be what you wanted, instead of embracing what I really am. She says I'm special, that I have potential most children lack." I backed toward the kitchen door, but Sophie stepped sideways to block my path with movements that were too quick, too coordinated for a child her age. "Where are you going?" she asked with mock concern. "Don't you want to hear about what else Margaret has taught me? She's shown me such wonderful things, memories from the old times, knowledge that died with the people who possessed it, secrets about how the world really works." "Sophie, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The doll is not your friend. She's not teaching you good things. She's trying to hurt you." Sophie's laugh was light and musical, but it raised every hair on my body. "Hurt me? Oh no, Mother. She's trying to save me. Do you know what it's like to be trapped in a child's body when your mind is capable of so much more? Margaret understands that frustration. She's helping me become who I was meant to be." The frost on the juice box spread to Sophie's fingers, but she didn't seem to notice or care that her skin was turning blue from the supernatural cold radiating through her body. "She's also teaching me about you and Daddy," Sophie continued conversationally. "About your fears, your weaknesses, the things you try to hide from me. Did you know that Daddy sometimes thinks about leaving us? Margaret showed me those thoughts. She can taste his unhappiness." This was beyond anything Mrs. Whitmore had described in her notes. Sophie wasn't just exhibiting behavioral changes, she was demonstrating supernatural abilities and knowledge that suggested the bonding process was accelerating far faster than expected. "Sophie, I want you to come with me right now. We're going to see a doctor." "I don't think so," she said, and suddenly she wasn't standing by the refrigerator anymore. She was between me and the kitchen doorway, though I hadn't seen her move. "Margaret says doctors can't help with what's happening to me. She says only she can guide me through the transformation." "What transformation?" Sophie's eyes began to change. The warm brown color I'd loved since the day she was born was shifting, becoming paler, more translucent, until they looked disturbingly similar to Evangeline's glass eyes. "The transformation that will let me join her properly," Sophie said, and now her voice was definitely not entirely her own anymore. There was another voice layered underneath, older and colder. "She's been alone in that doll for so long, Mother. She needs a real body to share, and mine is perfect for her purposes." I lunged forward and grabbed Sophie's arm, intending to physically remove her from the kitchen, but the moment my skin touched hers, I felt like I'd grabbed a piece of ice. The cold that radiated from her body was so intense it was painful, and I could see my own breath crystallizing in the air around us, but worse than the cold was what I saw when our skin made contact. For just a moment, I could see through Sophie's eyes into whatever realm the entity inhabited, and I glimpsed something that nearly shattered my sanity. I saw Margaret Bellwether as she truly was. Not the benevolent teacher she pretended to be in Sophie's mind, but a creature of pure hatred and hunger that had been twisted by decades of rage and isolation. Her face was a map of burn scars, her eyes were holes filled with fire, and her smile revealed teeth that had been sharpened to points. She had been feeding on the fear and life energy of everyone who'd encountered Evangeline over the years, growing stronger and more malevolent with each new family she terrorized, and she had chosen Sophie as her permanent host body. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because what I realized in that moment of supernatural contact changed everything about how I understood my daughter's situation. Sophie wasn't just being influenced by Margaret. She was being systematically hollowed out, prepared to become a vessel for something that had never been fully human, even when she was alive. Margaret's death in the fire had twisted her into something far worse than a ghost. She was a spiritual parasite that survived by consuming the life essence of children, and she'd been perfecting her techniques for nearly a century. I jerked my hand away from Sophie and stumbled backward, my fingers tingling with frostbite from the brief contact. Sophie watched me with those horrible glass-colored eyes, her head tilted at an angle that would have been impossible for human neck bones to achieve. "You saw her, didn't you?" Sophie asked with satisfaction. "Margaret says most adults can't handle the truth of what she is. She's impressed that you're still conscious." "Sophie, listen to me. This isn't you talking. This is something else, something that's trying to take over your mind. But it feels so much better than being just me," Sophie replied. "Being 8 years old is terribly limiting, Mother. Margaret is showing me what I could become if I stopped clinging to such a small, weak identity." The lights in the kitchen began to flicker, and I could hear scratching sounds coming from upstairs, from Sophie's bedroom, where Evangeline was presumably waiting for her young host to return. "She's getting impatient," Sophie observed. "She's been planning this bonding for so long, ever since she sensed our family moving into the area. She guided you to the estate sale, you know. Made sure you would see her, made sure you would want to buy her." The lights in the kitchen began to flicker, and I could hear scratching sounds coming from upstairs, from Sophie's bedroom, where Evangeline was presumably waiting for her young host to return. "She's getting impatient," Sophie observed. "She's been planning this bonding for so long, ever since she sensed our family moving into the area. She guided you to the estate sale, you know. Made sure you would see her, made sure you would want to buy her. She manipulated your thoughts, made you feel drawn to her display case, made you believe you were choosing her when really she was choosing you. Or rather, she was choosing Sophie." The supernatural cold emanating from my daughter was now so intense that frost was forming on the kitchen windows, despite the late summer heat outside. I could see my breath, and my fingers were starting to go numb from the temperature drop. "How is this possible?" I whispered, more to myself than to the thing that was wearing my daughter's face. "Margaret has had nearly a century to perfect her techniques," Sophie replied with that horrible adult composure. "Do you think we're the first family she's targeted? The Whitmores were just her most recent hosts before you. There have been dozens of others over the years. The Kellys in 1963, the Hendersons in 1978, the Martinez family in 1995. Each time, she learned more about the bonding process, refined her methods, became more efficient at claiming new vessels. I felt sick imagining all those families, all those children who had been targeted by this creature. What happened to them? Some escaped before the bonding was complete, Sophie said with a shrug that was far too casual for the topic. Those families managed to pass Evangeline on to someone else before stage 5, but others. Her smile became predatory. Others provided Margaret with temporary homes until she grew bored and decided to move on to better hosts. "You're not my daughter," I said, backing further away from her. "Oh, but I am," Sophie replied, and for just a moment her voice returned to normal, young, frightened, confused. "Mommy, help me. She's in my head and I can't make her stop. She's showing me things, terrible things, and she says if I don't let her take over completely, she'll hurt you and Daddy." My heart broke hearing my real daughter's voice, struggling to break through Margaret's influence. Sophie was still in there, still fighting, but the entity was using her love for us as a weapon to force cooperation. "Sophie, baby, I'm going to help you. I promise." But then the moment passed. and Margaret's cold intelligence returned to Sophie's features. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Mother. Sophie is learning to appreciate the gifts I'm offering her. Soon she won't want to go back to being an ordinary child." "And what gifts?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Knowledge," Sophie said, spreading her frost-covered fingers wide. "Power. The ability to see beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead. I'm teaching her to taste emotions, to feel the life force of every person she encounters. She's learning to influence minds, to make people see and believe things that aren't there. These are abilities that most humans never develop. Those aren't gifts, they're curses." "Are they?" Sophie tilted her head again, and I noticed that the movement was becoming more pronounced, more unnatural with each occurrence. "Or are they simply tools that can be used by someone wise enough to understand their value? Margaret has shown Sophie glimpses of what she could become. Powerful, feared, free from the limitations of mortality." The scratching sounds from upstairs were getting louder and more insistent. Whatever was up there, whatever Margaret's consciousness was doing to Evangeline, while her influence expanded through Sophie, it was becoming increasingly agitated. "She wants me to come upstairs now," Sophie said, glancing toward the ceiling. "The bonding process is entering a critical phase, and it requires my physical presence near the vessel. I won't let you go up there." Sophie's laugh was like ice crystals falling on glass. "You don't have a choice in the matter, Mother. I'm going upstairs now, and you're going to let me, because if you try to stop me, Margaret will make me hurt myself in ways that will traumatize you for the rest of your life." To demonstrate her point, Sophie raised one of her frost-covered hands and placed it against her own cheek. Immediately her skin began to turn red, then white, as if she was giving herself severe frostbite. "Stop!" I lunged forward, but Sophie held up her other hand in a warning gesture. "Margaret controls the temperature now," she explained calmly, even as angry red welts began forming where her frozen hand touched her skin. "She can make my body so cold that I'll suffer permanent damage, or so hot that I'll burn from the inside out. She's demonstrated both possibilities for me today while you were reading your little research papers." I felt helpless, watching my daughter being used as a weapon against herself. Every parental instinct screamed at me to grab her and run, but I knew that Margaret could hurt Sophie faster than I could help her. "What do you want from me?" I asked desperately. "I want you to understand that this is inevitable," Sophie replied, finally lowering her hand from her face, leaving behind a patch of damaged skin that looked like a severe burn. "Margaret is going to complete the bonding process with or without your cooperation. But if you fight her, Sophie will suffer unnecessarily during the transition. If you accept what's happening and allow the process to proceed naturally, Sophie's consciousness will be preserved as part of the merged entity. You're asking me to let you possess my daughter. I'm asking you to choose between having part of Sophie remain alive within me or losing her completely to the trauma of forced possession." It was an impossible choice, and we both knew it. Margaret was using my love for Sophie to manipulate me into compliance, offering me a false choice between two forms of losing her. Comment below if you've ever faced an impossible decision like this, because what happened next taught me that sometimes the only way to save someone you love is to risk everything. I made my decision in that moment, though it went against every instinct I had as a mother. Instead of continuing to argue with the entity wearing my daughter's face, I smiled and nodded. "You're right," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I can see that Sophie is happier with Margaret's guidance. If this is what she wants, then I should support her choice." Sophie's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Margaret had been manipulating people for nearly a century. She wasn't easily fooled. "You're lying," she said flatly. "No, I'm not. Look, I can see the changes in Sophie, and honestly, they're impressive. She's more articulate, more mature, more knowledgeable than she's ever been." Maybe this bonding is actually good for her. I moved closer to Sophie, trying to project calm acceptance while my mind raced through the options Mrs. Whitmore's notes had provided. Most of her attempted solutions had failed, but there had been one brief mention of something that had worked temporarily, something about mirrors. "I'd like to come upstairs with you," I said. "I want to see Evangeline again, to thank her for the gift she's giving Sophie." Sophie studied my face intently, and I could feel Margaret's supernatural senses probing my thoughts, looking for deception. I focused on projecting genuine curiosity and acceptance, burying my real intentions as deeply as possible. "Very well," Sophie said finally. "But if you're planning any kind of interference, Mother, I will make you watch as I destroy Sophie's mind completely. Do you understand?" "I understand." We walked toward the stairs together, and with each step, the temperature in the house seemed to drop further. By the time we reached the second floor, I could see my breath clearly, and ice was actually forming on the walls and ceiling. The scratching sounds were coming from Sophie's bedroom, along with what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't recognize. As we approached her door, I could see light flickering underneath. Not electric light, but the orange glow of flames. "She's showing me memories of the fire," Sophie explained, noticing my alarm. "Margaret wants me to understand what it felt like to burn alive, so I can appreciate the gift of sharing her immortal form." She opened the bedroom door, and what I saw inside nearly shattered my sanity completely. Evangeline was no longer sitting passively on the dresser. The doll was standing in the center of the room, moving with fluid, lifelike motions as she arranged Sophie's other toys in complex patterns on the floor. Her porcelain head turned toward us as we entered, and her glass eyes were no longer just reflective. They were glowing with internal fire. But the doll itself wasn't the most disturbing thing in the room. The walls were covered with symbols that hadn't been there that morning, intricate designs that seemed to writhe and shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The symbols were carved deep into the wallpaper and drywall, as if they'd been scratched there by claws. And everywhere, on every surface, covering every mirror, written across the windows in what looked like frost, was the same message repeated over and over in that same archaic script. "Margaret comes home. Welcome to our sanctuary," Sophie said, gesturing to the transformed bedroom with obvious pride. "Margaret has been preparing this space for the final stage of our bonding. Each symbol represents a different aspect of the power she'll share with me." Evangeline turned her head to focus on me, and when she opened her mouth, Margaret's voice came out, speaking through both the doll and my daughter simultaneously. "You are just in time to witness the completion of a century-long dream. This child will become my perfect vessel, young enough to provide decades of life, intelligent enough to appreciate the knowledge I offer." The temperature in the room was now so cold that I could barely feel my extremities, but I forced myself to step further into the space. I needed to get closer to the mirrors, specifically to Sophie's antique hand mirror that sat on her vanity table. Mrs. Whitmore's notes had mentioned that during the attempted exorcism in 1975, all the mirrors in the house had shattered when the priest tried to banish Margaret, and that the priest had reported seeing the face of a woman in great agony in the broken glass. If Margaret's spirit was bound to reflective surfaces as well as to the doll, then maybe the mirrors were a vulnerability. "This is amazing," I said, moving toward the vanity while keeping my voice filled with false admiration. "Sophie, you're so lucky to have a teacher like Margaret. I wish I'd had someone to guide me when I was your age." Sophie beamed with pride, but her smile was wrong, too wide, too knowing, too adult. "She's going to teach me everything, Mommy, about history, about death, about all the secrets that adults try to hide from children. Did you know that people used to bury children alive when they thought they were possessed? Margaret lived through those times. She remembers what it was like. I was almost close enough to reach the hand mirror now. The antique silver-backed glass was positioned so that it reflected both Sophie and Evangeline, creating a triangle of supernatural energy in the room. "That's fascinating," I said, taking another careful step. "Margaret must have so many stories to share." "Oh yes," Margaret's voice came from both Sophie and the doll again. "I have watched empires rise and fall. I have seen plagues sweep across continents. I have observed the evolution of human cruelty and the refinement of spiritual torment. This child will inherit all of my accumulated knowledge." Now I was close enough. I could see all three figures reflected in the antique mirror. Sophie with her glowing glass eyes, Evangeline with her unnaturally animated porcelain features, and myself, looking pale and terrified, but determined. "Margaret," I said, looking directly at the mirror instead of at Sophie or the doll, "I have a question for you." Both Sophie and Evangeline turned toward me with identical expressions of curiosity. "What is it, Mother?" I took a deep breath and spoke directly to Margaret's reflection in the mirror. "If you're so powerful, if you've learned so much over the past century, then why do you still look like a burned corpse?" The effect was immediate and devastating. Margaret's true form, the thing she really was beneath the beautiful facade she projected through Sophie and the doll, appeared in the mirror's surface. The reflection showed a woman whose flesh had been charred black, whose eye sockets were empty holes filled with flames, whose mouth was a cavity lined with broken, sharpened teeth. Her hair was gone, burned away to reveal a skull that was cracked and partially caved in. But more importantly, seeing her true reflection seemed to break whatever spell was allowing her to maintain control over both Sophie and Evangeline simultaneously. Sophie collapsed to her knees, screaming as Margaret's influence was suddenly severed. Her eyes returned to their normal brown color, and the supernatural cold that had been radiating from her body dissipated instantly. Evangeline, meanwhile, began to convulse violently, her porcelain limbs jerking and twitching as Margaret's consciousness snapped back into the doll with violent force. "What have you done?" Margaret's voice shrieked from the doll, but now it sounded distorted, weakened, as if the forced return to her original vessel had damaged her somehow. I grabbed Sophie and pulled her away from Evangeline, but the doll was already moving toward us with inhuman speed, her glass eyes blazing with rage. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how this supernatural nightmare ends, because what happened next determined whether my family would survive Margaret's century-long hunt for the perfect host. "Sophie, can you hear me?" I asked desperately, shaking my daughter gently as I dragged her toward the bedroom door. "Mommy?" Sophie's voice was weak and confused, but it was entirely her own again. "What's happening? Why is it so cold? And why does Evangeline look like she's moving?" Behind us, the doll was indeed moving, but not with the fluid grace she'd displayed earlier. Margaret's forced return to the porcelain vessel seemed to have damaged her ability to fully animate it. Evangeline was jerking and stumbling across the room like a marionette with tangled strings, leaving deep scratches in the hardwood floor with her ceramic fingers. "We need to get out of here right now," I said, pulling Sophie to her feet. But as we reached the bedroom doorway, it slammed shut with supernatural force. The handle was ice cold to the touch, and no matter how hard I pulled, the door wouldn't budge. "You cannot leave," Margaret's voice howled from the doll behind us. "The bonding will be completed. I have waited too long to be denied now." The symbols carved into the walls began to glow, with the same orange light I'd seen flickering under the door, and the temperature in the room started dropping again, not gradually this time, but rapidly, as if Margaret was pouring all of her remaining supernatural energy into creating a prison of ice and terror. "Mommy, I'm scared," Sophie whispered, pressing close to me as we watched Evangeline drag herself across the floor toward us. "Why is she moving like that? Dolls aren't supposed to move." "It's okay, baby. Mommy's going to fix this," but I wasn't sure how. Mrs. Whitmore's notes had made it clear that Margaret couldn't be easily destroyed or banished, and now she was trapped in the room with us, desperate and enraged. A desperate supernatural entity was far more dangerous than one operating according to a careful plan. The mirrors. That had to be the key. The hand mirror had revealed Margaret's true form and disrupted her control, but it was just sitting on the vanity table, still reflecting the horrible burned visage of the entity's real appearance. Maybe if I could break it. Sophie, I need you to get behind the bed and cover your eyes, I instructed. Can you do that for me? What are you going to do? I'm going to try to send Margaret away. Sophie nodded bravely and crawled behind her bed, pressing her face into her pillow. I could hear her muffled prayers, words she'd learned in Sunday school, mixed with her own desperate pleas for protection. Evangeline was halfway across the room now, her movements becoming more coordinated as Margaret poured more supernatural energy into animating the doll. The porcelain face was twisted into an expression of pure hatred, and when she opened her mouth, that horrible shrieking voice emerged again. The child is mine by right. I have claimed her. You cannot break a spiritual bond that has been sealed with blood and terror. What blood? I demanded, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Evangeline's head turned toward Sophie's hiding place behind the bed, and her glass eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. The child cut herself yesterday while playing with her toys, a small accident with scissors, but blood is blood, and when it falls in the presence of a bound spirit, it creates a permanent connection. My heart sank. Sophie had indeed come to me yesterday with a small cut on her finger, claiming she'd accidentally nicked herself while cutting paper for an art project. I'd cleaned and bandaged it without thinking twice, never imagining that Margaret might have orchestrated the accident to create a supernatural bond. That changes nothing, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Sophie is my daughter, and I won't let you have her. I moved toward the hand mirror, but Evangeline intercepted me with surprising speed. The doll's ceramic fingers wrapped around my ankle within human strength, and immediately my leg began to go numb from supernatural cold. You will not touch the mirror again, Margaret hissed. It causes me discomfort to see my true form reflected. I prefer to maintain the illusion of beauty. Because you're ashamed of what you really are, I said, kicking at the doll's grip with my free foot. You're not a powerful spirit or an ancient entity. You're just a burned corpse that's too pathetic to accept death. Evangeline's grip tightened, and I could feel my ankle beginning to freeze solid. But her rage at my words was also causing her to lose focus, and I managed to break free by pulling off my shoe and leaving it in her grasp. I lunged for the vanity table, but instead of grabbing the hand mirror, I swept my arm across the surface, knocking it and two other mirrors to the floor. They shattered on impact, sending reflective fragments flying across the room. The effect was even more dramatic than when I'd shown Margaret her reflection in the single mirror. Every piece of broken glass now showed a fragment of her true burned and mutilated form, creating a kaleidoscope of horror that surrounded her from every angle. Margaret's shriek of agony was so loud and piercing that I felt my eardrums strain. But more importantly, the multiple reflections seemed to be tearing her consciousness apart, pulling her spiritual essence in dozens of different directions simultaneously. Evangeline began to convulse violently, her porcelain limbs striking the floor and walls with enough force to crack and chip the ceramic. Dark smoke was pouring from the doll's glass eyes, and the temperature in the room fluctuated wildly between freezing cold and scorching heat. Stop this torment. Margaret's voice was fragmenting, becoming multiple voices speaking at different pitches and speeds. We cannot exist in fractured reflections. But I wasn't done. Evangeline was now thrashing on the floor like a fish out of water, her porcelain skin developing spiderweb cracks as the supernatural energy tearing through her became too much for the physical vessel to contain. "Mommy, what's happening?" Sophie called from behind the bed, her voice shaking with fear. "Stay where you are, baby. It's almost over." But I was wrong. Margaret had one final desperate gambit. Instead of continuing to fight the fractured reflections, she suddenly stopped resisting and allowed her consciousness to scatter among all the broken mirror pieces simultaneously. For a moment, the room fell silent, except for our heavy breathing. Then every shard of broken glass in the room began to move. They lifted from the floor and floated through the air like a cloud of razor-sharp butterflies, each piece reflecting a fragment of Margaret's burned face, creating a swirling constellation of hatred and malevolence that filled the entire room. "If I cannot have the child as my vessel," Margaret's voice came from each piece of glass simultaneously, creating a chorus of supernatural malice, "then I will ensure that no one can have her." Now, the glass fragments began to spin faster, creating a whirlwind of reflective death that was clearly intended to cut us to pieces. Some of the larger shards were already moving towards Sophie's hiding place behind the bed. I threw myself across the room, landing on top of my daughter just as the first pieces of glass reached us. I felt sharp edges slice through my clothes and into my back and arms, but I kept my body positioned to shield Sophie from the worst of the assault. "I love you, baby," I whispered into her ear as the supernatural storm of broken mirrors swirled around us. "Whatever happens, remember that Mommy loves you." But then, just when I was certain we were going to be torn apart by Margaret's final revenge, I heard a new voice in the room, weak and elderly, but filled with authority. "Margaret Bellwether, by the power of Christ, I command you to cease this violence and return to the realm of the dead." I looked up through the whirling glass to see Mrs. Whitmore standing in the bedroom doorway, except she was translucent, clearly a spirit herself, and she was holding what appeared to be a ghostly crucifix. "Eleanor," Margaret's multiple voices hissed from the glass fragments, "you meddle still, even in death. You have terrorized enough families, Margaret. Your time is over." Mrs. Whitmore stepped into the room, and immediately the spinning glass fragments began to slow and fall to the floor. Where her spiritual form passed, the supernatural cold dissipated, and the carved symbols on the walls faded to nothing. "I bound myself to this world, specifically to ensure that you would never successfully possess another child," Mrs. Whitmore explained, moving to stand between us and the few pieces of glass that were still trying to float menacingly through the air. "Clara was my daughter, and I failed to protect her from you. I will not fail again." The presence of another spirit, one that was apparently more powerful than Margaret, was disrupting the burned entity's control over the physical world. Evangeline had stopped moving entirely, now looking like nothing more than a damaged antique doll lying broken on the floor. "This is not over." Margaret's voice came from the doll one final time, weak and defeated. "I will find another family, another child. I am patient, I am eternal." "No," Mrs. Whitmore said firmly, "you are finished." The elderly spirit raised her crucifix, and a brilliant white light filled the room. I covered Sophie's eyes and squeezed mine shut, but I could still see the radiance through my eyelids. Margaret's final scream was cut short abruptly, and then there was perfect silence. When the light faded and I opened my eyes, Mrs. Whitmore was gone. Evangeline was lying motionless on the floor, looking like nothing more than a broken vintage doll. The symbols had vanished from the walls, the supernatural cold had lifted completely, and the room felt normal for the first time since we'd brought the doll home. Sophie peeked out from beneath me. "Is it over?" I looked around carefully, checking every corner of the room for any sign of lingering supernatural presence. But there was nothing, just a child's bedroom that needed some cleaning up after a supernatural battle. Yes, baby, it's over. But I was wrong about that too. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this warning, because what I discovered over the next few days taught me that some supernatural encounters leave permanent marks on the people who survive them. At first, everything seemed to return to normal. We cleaned up the broken glass, repaired the damaged walls, and disposed of Evangeline by having her cremated at a funeral home that specialized in unusual requests. I wanted to make absolutely certain that Margaret's spirit had no physical vessel to return to. Sophie seemed to recover completely from her ordeal. She went back to school, played with her friends, and showed no lasting effects from the supernatural possession attempt. If anything, she seemed more mature and thoughtful than before, though in a healthy way, rather than the disturbing adult-like behavior she'd exhibited under Margaret's influence. Mark returned from his business trip 3 days after the final confrontation, and I had to decide how much to tell him about what had happened. I settled on a simplified version. Sophie had been having nightmares about the antique doll, so we'd gotten rid of it. He accepted this explanation without question, probably assuming it was just typical childhood fears about an old toy. But there were subtle changes in our house that I noticed even if Mark didn't. Mirrors still made me nervous, not because I expected to see Margaret's burned face looking back at me, but because I'd learned that reflective surfaces could be windows into supernatural realms that were better left unexplored. I found myself avoiding looking directly into mirrors when possible, and I removed most of the decorative mirrors from our home. Sophie's relationship with reflections had changed too. She would brush her teeth or comb her hair while looking slightly to the side of the bathroom mirror, never making direct eye contact with her own reflection. When I asked her about it, she said looking in mirrors made her remember things she didn't want to remember. And more disturbing were the occasional moments when Sophie would demonstrate knowledge she couldn't possibly have acquired naturally. She would make comments about historical events with details that weren't taught in elementary school, or use vocabulary words that were far beyond her grade level. When pressed about where she'd learned these things, she would look confused and claim she didn't know. 3 weeks after the Evangeline incident, Sophie came to me with a question that sent chills down my spine. "Mummy, do you think Mrs. Whitmore is okay?" "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I dreamed about her last night. She looked tired, and she said she was having trouble resting because she used up too much of her spirit energy helping us. She asked me to tell you that she might not be strong enough to help other families if Margaret tries to come back." I had never told Sophie that Mrs. Whitmore had appeared in her bedroom that night. As far as Sophie knew, the supernatural assault had simply ended on its own. There was no way she could have known about the elderly spirit's intervention unless Mrs. Whitmore was actually communicating with her through dreams. Did she say anything else? Sophie nodded solemnly. She said that Margaret isn't completely gone. She's just sleeping. And that if anyone else ever brings Evangeline's ashes back together, Margaret might be able to return. This revelation terrified me. I'd thought that cremating the doll would end the threat permanently, but apparently Margaret's spirit was bound to the physical remains rather than truly destroyed. I spent the next day researching crematoriums and funeral homes, trying to determine exactly what had been done with Evangeline's ashes. The funeral director I'd worked with was helpful, but delivered news that made my heart sink. "Standard practice is to return cremated remains to the family," he explained. "But since you specifically requested disposal rather than return, we scattered the ashes in our memorial garden. However, I should mention that we had some unusual equipment malfunctions during the cremation process. The furnace kept shutting down, and we had to restart it several times before the process was complete. Even in death, even while being burned a second time, Margaret had been fighting to preserve her connection to the physical world. Is there any way to ensure that the ashes can never be collected or brought back together?" The funeral director looked puzzled by my urgency. Well, they're mixed with soil and other cremated remains in the garden now. It would be nearly impossible to separate them out. But may I ask why this is a concern? I couldn't explain that I was worried about supernatural resurrection, so I made up a story about wanting to ensure no one could ever use the ashes for identity theft or other criminal purposes. He accepted this explanation, but I could tell he thought I was being unnecessarily paranoid. Over the following months, I made regular visits to the crematorium's memorial garden, not to pay respects, but to make sure nothing unusual was happening. I looked for signs of supernatural activity, dead plants, temperature anomalies, reports of strange sightings from other visitors. For the most part, everything remained normal. But on one visit, about 6 months after Evangeline's cremation, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a small bare patch in the memorial garden where nothing would grow. The grass around it was healthy and green, but in one specific circle about 3 feet in diameter, the soil remained barren, despite the groundskeeper's repeated attempts to plant new grass. When I asked about it, the groundskeeper mentioned that they'd had problems with that particular spot ever since the beginning of the year. "Strangest thing," he said, shaking his head. "We've reseeded it a dozen times, tried different types of grass, even brought in new topsoil. But nothing takes root there. It's like the ground itself is rejecting any form of life." The bare patch was located in the exact area where the funeral director had told me Evangeline's ashes had been scattered. Margaret's spiritual energy was so toxic that it was preventing anything from growing in the soil that contained her remains. Even cremated and scattered, she was still exerting a corrupting influence on the physical world. I made the decision that day to move my family out of Connecticut. I couldn't risk staying in an area where Margaret's ashes were located, especially now that I knew her spirit was still active in some form. If she ever found a way to reconstitute herself, I wanted my family to be as far away as possible. Comment below if you think I made the right choice, because what happened during our move convinced me that Margaret's influence extended far beyond what I had imagined. We relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, about as far from Connecticut as we could get while staying in the continental United States. I found a new job, enrolled Sophie in a new school, and tried to start fresh. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. The desert climate was a welcome change from Connecticut's humidity, and Sophie appeared to thrive in her new environment. But then, the nightmares started again. Sophie began waking up in the middle of the night, claiming that she could hear someone calling her name, not just any voice, specifically Margaret's voice, distorted and echoing as if it was traveling across a great distance. "She says she's looking for me," Sophie told me after one particularly bad night. "She says distance doesn't matter because we're connected now. She says she can find me anywhere." And I took Sophie to see a child psychologist, hoping that professional therapy could help her process the trauma of her supernatural encounter. Dr. Martinez was kind and experienced, specializing in children who had experienced unusual or frightening events. But after several sessions, Dr. Martinez pulled me aside with a troubling observation. "Sophie is definitely processing some kind of trauma," she said carefully. "But there are aspects of her account that are unusual. She describes sensory experiences and emotional states that are remarkably sophisticated for a child her age. And some of the historical details she mentions during our sessions are surprisingly accurate." "What kind of historical details?" She's told me about life in the 1920s, specific details about clothing, social customs, even economic conditions that aren't typically covered in elementary school curriculum. When I asked where she learned these things, she said a burned lady had shown them to her in dreams. My heart sank. Margaret was still influencing Sophie, even from 2,000 miles away. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "Sophie drew some pictures during our last session. I'd like you to take a look at them." She handed me a folder containing several of Sophie's drawings. Most were typical child artwork, stick figures, houses, animals, but 3 of them made my hands shake. The first drawing showed a woman engulfed in flames, her mouth open in a scream. The detail was far beyond Sophie's usual artistic ability, with realistic shading and proportions that looked more like the work of an art student than an 8-year-old. The second drawing depicted a doll sitting in what was clearly a memorial garden, surrounded by dead flowers and bare earth. Again, the level of detail was unnaturally advanced. The third drawing was the most disturbing. It showed Sophie herself, but she was standing in 2 places simultaneously. One version looked normal and happy, while the other had glass eyes and burn scars covering half her face. "Sophie told me the last picture represents her choice," Dr. Martinez explained. "She says the burned lady visits her dreams every night and offers to teach her how to become more than human. Sophie is afraid that if she keeps saying no, the burned lady will get angry and hurt our family." Margaret wasn't just maintaining contact with Sophie. She was actively trying to continue the bonding process through supernatural means. The 2,000 miles of distance hadn't weakened their connection at all. "What do you recommend?" I asked Dr. Martinez. "Honestly, this is beyond my expertise. Sophie's descriptions are so vivid and detailed that they don't fit the pattern of typical childhood nightmares or trauma processing. If I didn't know better, I'd say she was actually experiencing ongoing contact with this entity she calls the burned lady." Dr. Martinez was a rational professional, but even she was starting to question whether Sophie's experiences might be genuinely supernatural rather than purely psychological. That night, I decided to test whether Margaret's influence was real or just lingering trauma. I waited until Sophie was asleep. Then I spoke aloud to the empty air in her bedroom. "Margaret, if you can hear me, leave my daughter alone. You failed to possess her in Connecticut and you can't reach her here." The response was immediate and terrifying. Every mirror in our new house cracked simultaneously. Not shattered, just developed single jagged cracks running down the center, as if something had struck them from the inside. The sound was like breaking bones echoing through every room of our home. Sophie sat up in bed instantly, her eyes wide with fear. "She heard you, Mommy. She's angry that you challenged her." I rushed to Sophie's bedside, my heart pounding as I realized that moving across the country had accomplished nothing. Margaret's spiritual connection to my daughter transcended physical distance, and my defiant words had only provoked her into a more aggressive response. "What did she say to you just now?" I asked, wrapping my arms around Sophie protectively. "She said that fire can travel anywhere, and that she's been getting stronger while we've been running away. She showed me the memorial garden again, but this time it was bigger. The dead spot where nothing grows has been expanding." This revelation filled me with dread. If Margaret's corrupting influence was growing stronger at the cremation site, it meant her spirit was somehow feeding off the location where her ashes were scattered. Distance wasn't protecting us because the supernatural bond was becoming more powerful over time, not weaker. Let me know in the comments if you've ever tried to escape something supernatural, because what I discovered next taught me that running only makes these entities more determined to reclaim what they consider theirs. Over the next week, the supernatural harassment escalated dramatically. Every night, Sophie would wake up screaming about dreams where Margaret showed her visions of other children the entity had possessed over the decades. The burned woman would parade these victims before Sophie like a collection, describing how much happier and more powerful they had become after accepting Margaret's gifts. But the dreams weren't just psychological torture. They were having physical effects on Sophie that terrified me. She began developing what looked like burn marks on her arms and legs. Not severe enough to require medical attention, but clearly visible as red welts that formed perfect patterns, as if someone had pressed heated objects against her skin. When I took Sophie to our new pediatrician, Dr. Chen examined the marks with obvious confusion. "These look like contact burns," she said, "but the patterns are too precise and symmetrical to be accidental." Has Sophie been exposed to any heated objects or chemicals? I couldn't explain that the marks were appearing during supernatural dream encounters, so I claimed ignorance and asked if stress could cause physical symptoms that resembled burns. Dr. Chen was skeptical, but prescribed a mild sedative to help Sophie sleep more peacefully. The sedative didn't work. If anything, it seemed to make Sophie more vulnerable to Margaret's influence because she couldn't wake herself up when the nightmares became too intense. 3 days after starting the medication, Sophie came to breakfast with something that made my blood freeze. Carved into her forearm, as if someone had used a sharp instrument while she slept, was the same symbol I'd seen scratched into her bedroom walls back in Connecticut. "Sophie, what happened to your arm?" She looked down at the carved symbol with the same calm, adult composure that had terrified me during Margaret's attempted possession. "She's marking me so other spirits know I belong to her. She says it's like signing a contract. This mark means I've agreed to complete the bonding process." "You didn't agree to anything." "I did, Mommy." Sophie's voice was her own, but her words carried a resignation that was heartbreaking. "Last night, she showed me what she'll do to you and Daddy if I keep refusing her. She can make people burn from the inside out, just like what happened to her. I saw her do it to other families who tried to protect their children from her. Margaret was using Sophie's love for us as leverage, just as she had in Connecticut. But now the threats were more specific and more credible because Margaret's power had grown stronger during the months since our initial encounter. "She's going to visit me again tonight," Sophie continued, showing me the carved symbol on her arm. "And this time, I'm going to say yes to her offers. I don't want you and Daddy to get hurt because of me." I felt sick, realizing that my 8-year-old daughter was prepared to sacrifice herself to protect Mark and me from supernatural revenge. Margaret had manipulated the situation perfectly, using Sophie's natural protective instincts to force compliance with the possession. That afternoon, while Sophie was at school, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of continuing to fight Margaret's influence defensively, I was going to take the battle directly to her. I booked a flight back to Connecticut. Comment below if you think confronting a supernatural entity in its place of power is brave or foolish, because what I found at that memorial garden challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of spirits and the afterlife. I flew back to Connecticut that same evening, leaving Sophie with Mark and telling him I had to handle some unfinished business related to our old house. It wasn't entirely a lie. Margaret was definitely unfinished business that needed to be resolved permanently. I arrived at the crematorium's memorial garden just after midnight, carrying a bag of supplies I'd purchased at various stores during my layover in Denver. Salt, iron filings, holy water from 3 different churches, a handheld mirror, and a digital voice recorder. The memorial garden looked different in the darkness. What had been a small, bare patch during my previous visit was now a circle of dead earth, nearly 10 feet in diameter. The corruption was spreading exactly as Sophie had described in her nightmares. But more disturbing was what I could see within that circle of barren ground. Rising from the earth like twisted plants were what appeared to be partially formed hands, dozens of them, all reaching upward as if trying to claw their way out of the soil. These weren't real hands, I realized as I got closer. They were manifestations of spiritual energy, the ghostly remnants of all the victims Margaret had possessed over the past century. She wasn't just growing stronger from her cremated remains. She was drawing power from the spiritual essence of every child she'd ever claimed. "I knew you would come back." Margaret's voice drifted across the garden, seeming to emerge from the ground itself. Maternal instinct is so predictable. You cannot bear the thought of losing your precious daughter, so you have come to bargain with me directly. I'm not here to bargain, I said, setting my supplies down at the edge of the corrupted circle. I'm here to end this permanently. Margaret's laughter rose from the earth like smoke. You think your amateur collection of folk remedies can destroy a spirit who has survived cremation? I am beyond your mortal understanding of death and existence. Maybe, but I'm not trying to destroy you. I opened the bag and began spreading salt in a careful circle around the perimeter of the dead zone. I'm trying to trap you. The spiritual hands reaching up from the soil began to move more frantically, grasping at the air as if sensing danger. Margaret's laughter cut off abruptly. What are you doing? Creating a binding circle, I explained, continuing to lay down the salt line. If you're drawing power from this location, then containing you here should cut off your ability to reach Sophie across the country. I had researched binding rituals during my flight, using the airplane's Wi-Fi to access every supernatural website and occult forum I could find. The consensus seemed to be that spirits tied to specific locations could be trapped there if the right barriers were established. Foolish woman. Salt circles are children's games. I've existed for nearly a century. Do you think I haven't encountered such amateur attempts at spirit binding before? But even as Margaret dismissed my efforts, I could sense her growing agitation. The spiritual hands were now clawing desperately at the salt line, trying to break the circle before I could complete it. I finished the salt barrier and moved on to the iron filings, creating a second circle just inside the first one. Iron was supposed to disrupt supernatural energy, making it harder for spirits to manifest in the physical world. "Stop this immediately!" Margaret's voice boomed from the corrupted earth, and suddenly the temperature around me dropped by at least 30 degrees. "I will make your daughter suffer unimaginable torments if you do not cease this binding attempt." "You're going to do that anyway," I replied, continuing to work methodically. "At least this way you'll be stuck here instead of free to hunt other families." The holy water came next, not sprinkled, but poured in a continuous stream to create a third barrier circle. As the blessed water soaked into the ground, the spiritual hands reaching up from Margaret's grave began to smoke and dissolve. "No, those are mine. You cannot free them." I realized that the ghostly hands weren't just manifestations of Margaret's power. They were the trapped souls of her previous victims, bound to her even in death. The holy water was severing those connections, allowing the children's spirits to finally move on to whatever came after death. Margaret's screams of rage and loss filled the night air as more and more of the spiritual hands faded away, taking with them decades of accumulated supernatural energy. She was becoming weaker with each soul that escaped her control. But I wasn't finished. I pulled out the handheld mirror and positioned it at the center of the binding circles, angled so that it reflected the corrupted earth where Margaret's ashes were buried. "Look at yourself, Margaret," I commanded, activating the voice recorder to capture what happened next. "Look at what you really are." The mirror's surface filled with the same burned, mutilated visage I'd seen in Sophie's bedroom. Hollow eye sockets filled with flames, charred flesh hanging from a skull that was cracked and partially collapsed. But this time, the reflection seemed to cause Margaret physical pain as well as psychological torment. The corrupted earth began to bubble and smoke as if acid was eating through it from below. Margaret's screams became so intense that windows in the crematorium building began to crack and car alarms started going off in the nearby parking lot. "You want to see what you really are?" I shouted over the supernatural chaos. "You're not a powerful ancient spirit. You're not a mystical entity with centuries of wisdom. You're just a dead woman who can't accept that her life is over." The mirror cracked as Margaret's true reflection fought against being contained, but it held long enough for me to complete the final element of the binding ritual. By your true name, Margaret Bellwether, by your true form, burned and broken, by your true nature, dead and gone, I bind you to this place until the sun burns out and the earth turns cold. You will never again reach beyond these circles. You will never again touch the living. You will never again claim another child. The effect was immediate and absolute. Margaret's screams cut off instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The corrupted earth stopped smoking and bubbling, settling into ordinary dirt. The spiritual hands reaching up from the ground crumbled into dust that was immediately scattered by the night wind. Most importantly, I could feel the supernatural cold that had been radiating from the site dissipate completely. The binding had worked. Margaret was trapped within the triple circle of salt, iron, and holy water, cut off from the rest of the world. Hit that like button if you want to know whether the binding held, because what I discovered when I called home changed everything I thought I knew about protecting my family from supernatural threats. I called Mark immediately, desperate to know if Sophie had felt any change in Margaret's influence. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, sounding groggy and confused. "Hello? Mark, it's me. How is Sophie? Has anything unusual happened tonight?" "Sophie? She's fine. She's been sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. No nightmares, no screaming, no mysterious marks appearing on her skin. Why?" Relief flooded through me like a physical wave. The binding had worked exactly as intended. By trapping Margaret at the cremation site, I'd severed her supernatural connection to Sophie completely. "I'll explain everything when I get home tomorrow," I told Mark. "Just keep an eye on Sophie tonight, and let me know if anything changes." "All right, but you're starting to worry me with all this mysterious behavior. What's really going on?" "I promise I'll tell you the whole story soon. I love you." I hung up and looked back at the memorial garden. The triple binding circle was holding perfectly, containing Margaret's malevolent presence within a space no larger than a small bedroom. For the first time since we'd brought Evangeline home, I felt genuine hope that my family might finally be safe, but I was wrong to celebrate so quickly. 3 hours later, as I was checking into a hotel near the airport to wait for my morning flight, my phone rang again. This time it was Sophie calling, not Mark. "Mommy?" Her voice was small and frightened, but it was entirely her own, no trace of Margaret's adult composure or supernatural influence. "Hi, baby. Daddy said you were sleeping well tonight." I was, but then I woke up and heard someone calling for help. Not Margaret, someone else, a lady who sounds really scared. My heart started racing again. What kind of help is she asking for? She says her name is Eleanor, and she's trapped somewhere cold and dark. She says Margaret is gone, but now she can't find her way to the light because she used up too much of her energy helping us fight the burned lady, Mrs. Whitmore. In my focus on binding Margaret, I hadn't considered what would happen to the elderly spirit who had sacrificed her own supernatural energy to save us from the entity's final assault. She says she's lost, Mommy. She says she stayed in our world too long trying to protect other families from Margaret, and now she doesn't know how to move on to where she's supposed to go. I felt a crushing weight of guilt. Mrs. Whitmore had bound herself to the physical plane, specifically to stop Margaret from possessing more children. She had given up her own peaceful death to become our protector, and now, because of my binding ritual, she was trapped in some kind of supernatural limbo. "What does she want me to do?" I asked Sophie. "She says you need to come back to the garden and help her cross over properly. She says there's a way to use the binding circle you created to send her to the light instead of keeping spirits trapped." I looked at my watch. It was 3:30 a.m. and my flight back to Phoenix was scheduled for 8:00 a.m. I could return to the memorial garden, attempt to help Mrs. Whitmore's spirit find peace, and still make my flight if everything went smoothly. But helping Mrs. Whitmore would require modifying the binding ritual that was currently keeping Margaret contained. There was a risk that weakening the barriers could allow the malevolent entity to escape. Tell Mrs. Whitmore I'll come back, I decided. But Sophie, I need you to promise me something. If Margaret's voice starts appearing in your dreams again, even for a second, you wake up Daddy immediately and you call me. Can you do that? I promise, Mommy. Share this video with someone who believes in helping lost souls, because what happened when I tried to guide Mrs. Whitmore to the afterlife taught me that supernatural gratitude can be just as powerful as supernatural revenge. I returned to the memorial garden at 4 a.m., bringing additional supplies I'd purchased at a 24-hour convenience store. White candles, a compass, and a small Bible I'd found in my hotel room. The binding circle was still intact, and I could sense Margaret's presence trapped within it, angry, frustrated, but completely contained. The corrupted earth had returned to normal soil, and grass was already beginning to sprout around the edges where the holy water had purified the ground. "Mrs. Whitmore?" I called out softly. "Sophie said you needed help crossing over." The elderly spirit materialized slowly, looking even more translucent and fragile than she had during our encounter in Sophie's bedroom. Her ghostly form flickered like a candle flame in the wind, and I could see that maintaining her presence in the physical world was requiring tremendous effort. "Thank you for returning," she said, her voice barely audible. "I have been wandering between worlds for months, trying to find the path to whatever comes next. But I bound myself too tightly to this realm in my determination to stop Margaret. What do I need to do to help you?" Mrs. Whitmore gestured toward the binding circle. "The ritual you performed creates a barrier between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, but it can also serve as a doorway if the intention is changed from binding to release." She explained the process while I lit the white candles and arranged them at specific points around the circle. Instead of trapping supernatural energy within the barriers, I needed to create a pathway that would allow benevolent spirits to pass through to whatever lay beyond death. "But won't this release Margaret as well?" I asked, concerned about weakening the containment. "Not if the pathway is specifically keyed to souls seeking redemption and peace," Mrs. Whitmore replied. "Margaret's spirit is too consumed with hatred and revenge to pass through a doorway meant for healing. She will remain trapped while I am finally able to find my rest." The modification required me to walk the circle 3 times counterclockwise while reciting a prayer of release, then stand at the center and call upon all spirits seeking peace and redemption to find their way to the light. As I completed the ritual, Mrs. Whitmore's form began to glow with a warm golden radiance. The flickering uncertainty in her appearance stabilized, and for a moment she looked exactly as she must have in life. A kind, determined woman who had spent her final years trying to protect other families from the evil that had claimed her daughter. "I can see the light now," she said, her voice filled with wonder and relief. "Clara is there, waiting for me. She looks exactly as she did before Margaret claimed her." A pathway of golden light appeared in the air above the binding circle, stretching upward until it disappeared beyond my ability to perceive. Mrs. Whitmore began to rise toward it, becoming more radiant and peaceful with each passing moment. But before she disappeared entirely, she turned back to me with an expression of gratitude and warning. "The binding will hold Margaret for as long as the physical circles remain undisturbed," she said. "But be warned. She will try to influence people to damage the barriers. She will whisper to groundskeepers, to visitors, to anyone who comes near her prison. Never let Sophie return to this place, no matter how much time passes." "I understand. And remember, your daughter carries a small part of Margaret's essence within her now, a fragment that was transferred during the attempted bonding. It will fade over time as Sophie grows older, but until it does, she may experience occasional supernatural sensitivity. Dreams, visions, the ability to see spirits that others cannot perceive. This is not necessarily dangerous, but it makes her vulnerable to other supernatural entities who might seek to exploit that sensitivity. This revelation terrified me. Even though I'd stopped Margaret's possession attempt and trapped the entity permanently, Sophie would carry supernatural scars from the encounter for years to come. How do I protect her? Love her. Trust her when she tells you about strange experiences. Teach her that supernatural sensitivity is a gift that can be used to help others, not just a vulnerability to be exploited. And never ever dismiss her concerns about supernatural encounters as just imagination. Mrs. Whitmore smiled one final time. "Thank you for giving me the chance to see my Clara again. Your family's courage saved not just your own daughter, but my soul as well." She rose into the golden pathway and disappeared, leaving behind a sense of peace and completion that filled the memorial garden like a gentle breeze. I checked the binding circle one more time, ensuring that Margaret was still securely contained within the barriers. The malevolent entity was definitely still trapped, but I could sense her fury at watching Mrs. Whitmore find the peace and redemption that would forever be denied to her. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation, because the decision I made next determined whether my family would live normally or spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders for supernatural threats. I could have returned to Phoenix immediately, confident that Margaret was contained and Mrs. Whitmore was at peace. The immediate supernatural threat to my family was neutralized, and Sophie was safe from possession. But Mrs. Whitmore's warning about Sophie's lingering supernatural sensitivity troubled me. If my daughter was going to experience ongoing supernatural encounters because of her brief connection to Margaret, then I needed to prepare her for that reality. Instead of flying home immediately, I spent the rest of the week in Connecticut, researching everything I could about children who had survived supernatural encounters. I visited libraries, spoke with local historians, and even tracked down a few elderly residents who remembered other families that had dealt with Margaret over the decades. What I discovered was both encouraging and sobering. Children who survived attempted possessions often did develop heightened supernatural sensitivity, but this ability typically manifested as a form of psychic protection rather than increased vulnerability. They became naturally resistant to malevolent spiritual influence while remaining able to perceive benevolent spirits who needed help. Several of the families I spoke with described children who grew up to become what could only be called supernatural helpers, people who could identify haunted locations, communicate with lost spirits, and guide troubled souls toward peace and resolution. My grandson, Tommy, survived an encounter with something evil when he was about Sophie's age, one elderly woman told me. For years afterward, he would have dreams about spirits who needed help finding their way to the light. At first, we thought it was trauma, but eventually we realized he was actually helping these lost souls move on to whatever comes after death. Another family described a daughter who had become something of a local legend for her ability to clean haunted houses by communicating with the spirits and helping them resolve whatever was keeping them bound to the physical world. Sarah never saw it as a curse, the girl's mother explained. She said it was like being a translator between the world of the living and the world of the dead. She helped dozens of families over the years, and she never encountered anything as malevolent as the entity that first gave her the sensitivity. These stories gave me hope that Sophie's supernatural sensitivity might become a gift rather than a burden. But they also made it clear that I needed to approach her experiences with understanding rather than fear. When I finally returned to Phoenix, I sat down with Sophie and Mark and told them the complete truth about everything that had happened. Margaret's history, the possession attempt, the binding ritual, and Mrs. Whitmore's sacrifice. Mark was skeptical at first, as I'd expected. But when Sophie corroborated details I hadn't shared with her, And when she demonstrated her ability to sense supernatural presences in our neighborhood, he had to accept that our family had genuinely encountered something beyond normal human experience. "So what happens now?" Mark asked after I'd finished the entire story. "Now we learn to live with Sophie's new abilities," I said. "We support her, we believe her when she tells us about supernatural encounters, and we help her use her sensitivity to help other people instead of being afraid of it." Comment below if you think supernatural abilities in children should be embraced or suppressed, because what happened over the following year taught me that some gifts are meant to be shared with the world. Sophie's supernatural sensitivity manifested in subtle but consistent ways over the next 12 months. She would occasionally mention seeing sad people in certain locations, spirits who had died but hadn't moved on to whatever came after death. Unlike Margaret, these entities were lost rather than malevolent, confused rather than manipulative. At first, these encounters happened infrequently, maybe once a month, usually in older buildings or locations where traumatic events had occurred. Sophie would describe seeing a spirit, explain what seemed to be troubling them, and within a few days, the supernatural presence would disappear as the lost soul found its way to peace. But gradually, word began to spread in our new community that Sophie possessed an unusual ability to help with difficult supernatural situations. Families dealing with unexplained phenomena in their homes began asking for her assistance, and Sophie's reputation as a ghost helper grew organically. The first official case came when our neighbors, the Johnsons, asked if Sophie might be able to help them with strange noises and cold spots in their century-old Victorian house. Their 8-year-old son had been having nightmares about the sad lady in the attic, and they'd exhausted conventional explanations for the phenomena. Sophie spent an afternoon in their house and emerged with a detailed story about a woman named Catherine who had died in childbirth in 1924. The spirit was trapped in the attic because she was desperately trying to protect a baby who had actually survived and been raised by relatives. Catherine didn't know her child had lived and thrived, so she couldn't find peace. With Sophie serving as a translator, we were able to research Catherine's history and discover that her son had indeed survived, grown up, served in World War II, and lived a full life before dying of natural causes in 1998. When Sophie shared this information with Catherine's spirit, the supernatural phenomena in the Johnson house ceased immediately. "It's like she was finally able to let go and move on," Sophie explained after the encounter. "She just needed to know that her baby was okay." Over the following months, similar requests came from families throughout Phoenix. Sophie helped resolve haunted house situations, assisted spirits who had died in accidents and were confused about their state, and even helped a few entities who had been traumatized by encounters with malevolent forces like Margaret. Each successful resolution seemed to strengthen Sophie's abilities and increase her confidence in using them positively. She was no longer a victim of supernatural influence. She had become a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But the most significant case came on the first anniversary of our encounter with Evangeline, when Sophie woke up one morning with an urgent message. "Mommy, there's a family in Connecticut who needs our help. A little girl named Emma has been having nightmares about a burned lady, and her parents think she's just having bad dreams, but I can see that she's really in danger." My blood ran cold. Margaret was supposed to be permanently contained within the binding circle at the Memorial Garden. If she was reaching out to another child, it meant either the binding had failed or she had found a way to work around it. "Are you sure it's Margaret?" Sophie nodded gravely. "I can feel her anger through the connection she left in me. She's still trapped, but she's trying to influence people to damage the salt circle. She's been whispering to groundskeepers and maintenance workers, making them feel compelled to clean up the Memorial Garden. The binding circle required physical barriers to maintain its integrity. If Margaret could convince someone to disturb the salt, iron, and holy water lines, she might be able to escape her supernatural prison. The little girl, Emma, she's the daughter of one of the groundskeepers, Sophie continued. Margaret is using her connection to him to reach the child, trying to create a new host body that she can possess if she manages to break free. I realized that I had to return to Connecticut immediately, not just to reinforce the binding circle, but to protect Emma from Margaret's influence. And this time, I wouldn't be going alone. Sophie, do you think you could help Emma the same way Mrs. Whitmore helped us? I think so, but I'd need to be there in person to create a strong enough barrier. Margaret is more dangerous now because she's desperate. She knows the binding won't last forever, and she's putting all her remaining energy into finding a way to escape. I made a decision that would have terrified me a year earlier, but now seemed like the natural next step in Sophie's development as a supernatural helper. We were going back to Connecticut together, and Sophie was going to use her abilities to protect Emma and reinforce the barriers that kept Margaret contained. Mark was understandably concerned about exposing Sophie to Margaret's influence again, but he also understood that our daughter's supernatural sensitivity came with responsibilities as well as abilities. If Sophie can help protect another child from what she went through, he said, then we have to support her in doing that. And 3 days later, Sophie and I were on a plane back to Connecticut, carrying supplies for reinforcing the binding ritual and preparing for what might be our final confrontation with Margaret Bellwether. Hit that subscribe button if you want to see how a child with supernatural abilities can triumph over an entity that has terrorized families for nearly a century. Because what happened in that memorial garden proved that some gifts are powerful enough to change the balance between good and evil in the supernatural world. We arrived at the memorial garden just after sunset, bringing Emma and her parents with us. I had contacted the Hendersons, Emma's family, and explained the situation as clearly as possible. Like Mark had been, they were initially skeptical, but Emma's detailed nightmares about Margaret's burned appearance and her knowledge of historical details she couldn't have learned naturally convinced them that something supernatural was genuinely threatening their daughter. The memorial garden looked exactly as I'd left it a year earlier, with one crucial difference. Someone had disturbed the northwest section of the binding circle. About 3 feet of the salt line had been scattered, creating a gap in the containment barrier. She's been working on them for months, Sophie said, studying the damaged circle. Every day, whispering to the groundskeepers, making them feel compelled to clean up the memorial garden. She almost convinced Emma's dad to bring a leaf blower here last week. Mr. Henderson nodded reluctantly. I did feel a strange urge to come here and clean the grounds, even though it's not technically part of my job responsibilities. I thought it was just pride in the cemetery's appearance, but now you know Margaret was influencing your thoughts, I finished. She's been using your connection to Emma to extend her reach beyond the binding circle. Emma herself was a shy 7-year-old who looked remarkably similar to how Sophie had appeared at that age. She stayed close to her parents, but her eyes kept drifting toward the damaged binding circle, as if she could sense the malevolent presence trapped within it. She visits me every night, Emma said quietly when I knelt down to speak with her directly. She says she wants to teach me things, and that she can make me special like the other children she's helped before. What kind of things does she want to teach you? How to make people do what I want by thinking at them really hard. How to make myself cold enough to freeze water. How to see people's fears and use them to make people scared. Emma shuddered. She says, if I let her share my body, I'll be able to do magic. Margaret was using the same manipulation techniques she had tried with Sophie, offering power and knowledge to entice a child into accepting possession. But this time, Sophie was here to provide protection and guidance that hadn't been available during our original encounter. "Emma, I want you to meet my daughter Sophie," I said, gesturing for Sophie to join our conversation. She had dreams about the same burned lady, but she found a way to make them stop. Sophie sat down beside Emma and spoke with the kind of mature compassion that still amazed me, even after witnessing her supernatural development over the past year. "The burned lady lies about everything," Sophie told Emma gently. "She says she wants to help you become special, but really she just wants to take over your body so she can hurt other people. The things she promises to teach you, they're not magic. They're ways to cause pain and fear." "But she showed me how she helped other children become powerful," Emma protested. "She showed me kids who could do incredible things after she taught them." "Those weren't children anymore," Sophie explained. "They were her, wearing the children's bodies like costumes, the real children. Their souls were trapped inside, watching her use their faces to hurt people." Emma's eyes widened with horror as she began to understand the true nature of Margaret's gifts. "Can you make her stop visiting my dreams?" Emma asked Sophie desperately. "I can do better than that," Sophie replied. "I can teach you how to protect yourself from her and how to help other kids if she tries to visit them too." Sophie spent the next hour teaching Emma techniques for supernatural self-defense, methods for recognizing malevolent spiritual influence, ways to strengthen her natural resistance to possession attempts, and prayers that could be used to banish hostile entities. Meanwhile, I worked on repairing the damaged binding circle, using fresh salt, iron filings, and holy water to restore the containment barriers. But as I worked, I could sense Margaret's growing agitation and desperation. "You cannot keep me here forever." Margaret's voice rose from the earth, filled with centuries of accumulated hatred. "I will find a way to escape, and when I do, I will claim both children as payment for your interference." "No, you won't," Sophie said calmly, walking to the edge of the binding circle, "because I'm not going to just repair the barriers. I'm going to make them permanent." Sophie pulled out a small silver locket that I'd never seen before, something she must have acquired during her research into supernatural protection methods. "This contains a piece of blessed salt from every church in Connecticut," she explained. "If I bury this at the center of your prison, Margaret, the binding circle will become self-renewing. Every time you try to influence someone to damage the barriers, they'll automatically repair themselves." Margaret's shriek of rage shook the ground beneath our feet, but Sophie stood firm, unaffected by the supernatural tantrum. "You're finished terrorizing families," Sophie continued. "You're finished claiming children. You're finished spreading fear and pain. From now on, you're just going to sit here in the dark until you learn how to let go of your hatred and move on to whatever comes after death." Sophie walked to the center of the binding circle and buried the locket in the exact spot where Margaret's ashes had been scattered. The effect was immediate and absolute. The containment barriers began to glow with a soft silver light, and the corrupted earth transformed into healthy soil that would support new growth. Margaret's screams faded to whispers, then to silence. The binding was now beyond her power to break or circumvent, reinforced by spiritual energy that would last as long as the earth itself. Emma looked up at Sophie with obvious admiration. "Will you teach me how to do that?" "Someday," Sophie replied with a smile. "But first, you need to practice the protection techniques. And remember, our job isn't to trap evil spirits. Our job is to help lost souls find peace and to protect living people from supernatural harm." Comment below what you think Sophie should do with her abilities as she grows older, because what happened over the next few years proved that some children are destined to become guardians of the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. 5 years later, Sophie is now 13, and her reputation as a supernatural helper has grown far beyond our local community. Families from across the country contact us when they're dealing with genuinely supernatural phenomena, and Sophie has successfully resolved dozens of cases involving lost spirits, haunted locations, and even a few encounters with malevolent entities that were thankfully far less dangerous than Margaret had been. But the most remarkable change has been in Sophie herself. The frightened 8-year-old who once cowered from supernatural encounters has grown into a confident teenager who approaches each case with wisdom and compassion that continues to amaze everyone who meets her. She's developed what she calls her supernatural toolkit, a collection of blessed objects, protective symbols, and ritual techniques that she's gathered from various religious traditions and occult sources. More importantly, she's learned to distinguish between spirits who need help and entities that pose genuine threats. The key, Sophie explained to me recently, is understanding that most supernatural encounters aren't actually dangerous. Lost spirits, confused ghosts, even residual hauntings, these are usually just echoes of trauma that need to be acknowledged and resolved. It's only the truly malevolent entities like Margaret that require binding or banishment. Last month, we received a call from a family in Oregon whose 10-year-old son was experiencing supernatural phenomena remarkably similar to what Sophie had endured with Margaret. The parents were desperate, having exhausted medical and psychological explanations for their child's nightmares and the physical manifestations occurring in their home. Sophie and I flew to Portland, and within hours of meeting the boy, Kevin, Sophie had identified the threat, a malevolent spirit that had been feeding off the family's fear for months, growing stronger with each frightened reaction. But unlike Margaret, this entity wasn't seeking possession. It was what Sophie called a fear parasite, a supernatural being that sustained itself by generating terror in living people, particularly children who were more sensitive to spiritual influence. The good news, Sophie told Kevin's parents, is that fear parasites are actually much easier to banish than possession entities. They can't survive without constant terror to feed on, so if we cut off their food source, they'll move on to find easier targets. Sophie taught Kevin the same protection techniques she'd learned years earlier, but she also introduced him to something new, a method for transforming fear into curiosity and compassion. When you see something scary, she explained to Kevin, instead of being afraid, try to understand why it's appearing to you. Is it lost? Is it in pain? Is it trying to communicate something important? Most supernatural entities are just people who died, but haven't figured out how to move on yet. The transformation in Kevin's experiences was remarkable. Within a week, his nightmares had stopped. The supernatural phenomena in his house had ceased, and he'd actually begun helping other spirits in his neighborhood find peace and resolution. It's like Sophie gave him a completely different way to understand the supernatural world, Kevin's mother told me during our follow-up call. Instead of being afraid of ghosts, he's become their helper. This has become Sophie's signature approach to supernatural sensitivity in children, teaching them to see their abilities as gifts rather than curses, and showing them how to use their spiritual awareness to help both the living and the dead. She's even started writing a book about her experiences, tentatively titled A Bridge Between Worlds Growing Up Supernatural. The first chapter begins, "Most people think that seeing ghosts is terrifying, but I've learned that the scariest thing about the supernatural world is how much pain and confusion exists there, and how much healing can happen when someone is willing to listen." Emma Henderson, the little girl we saved from Margaret 5 years ago, has become one of Sophie's most dedicated students. Now 12 years old, Emma has developed her own supernatural abilities and regularly assists Sophie with cases involving younger children. Together, they've created an informal network of supernatural helpers, children and teenagers who survived supernatural encounters and decided to use their experiences to protect others. They communicate through a private online forum where they share case studies, protective techniques, and emotional support for dealing with the challenges of supernatural sensitivity. The network has prevented at least a dozen potential possession attempts, helped resolve countless haunting situations, and provided guidance for hundreds of families dealing with unexplained phenomena. But perhaps most importantly, they've changed the narrative around supernatural encounters, from victims being terrorized by evil forces to gifted individuals bridging the gap between worlds to bring healing and resolution. Nardidi, as I write this final entry in our family's supernatural journey, I can hear Sophie in her room talking on the phone with a mother in Texas whose daughter has been having dreams about a sad man in old-fashioned clothes appearing in their recently purchased historic home. The first thing to understand, Sophie is saying in her patient, compassionate voice, is that your daughter isn't in danger. She's being trusted with an opportunity to help someone who's been lost for a very long time. Let me teach you both how to approach this safely. Margaret Bellwether is still contained within her binding circle at the Memorial Garden in Connecticut. According to the groundskeepers, the area has become one of the most peaceful spots in the entire cemetery, with flowers blooming year-round and wildlife gathering there as if drawn by some invisible force of harmony. Sophie checks on the binding remotely every few months, using her supernatural sensitivity to ensure that Margaret remains securely trapped. But she's also been working on something more ambitious, a ritual that might eventually allow Margaret to find redemption and move on to whatever comes after death. Even the most evil spirits were once human, Sophie explained to me recently. Margaret became what she was because of centuries of hatred and pain. If she could learn to let go of that anger, she might be able to find peace instead of being trapped forever. It's a mature perspective that continues to amaze me. The daughter who once cowered from supernatural encounters now approaches even the most malevolent entities with compassion and hope for their eventual healing. Mark and I have adapted to our new reality as parents of a supernatural helper. Our house has become an unofficial headquarters for families dealing with paranormal phenomena, and our phone rings regularly with requests for Sophie's assistance. It's not the normal family life we'd expected when Sophie was born, but it's become something far more meaningful, a chance to help people during their most frightening and confusing moments, and to contribute to a growing understanding that the supernatural world doesn't have to be a source of terror. As I finish writing this account, I want to leave you with the most important lesson our family learned during our journey from supernatural victims to supernatural helpers. Fear is a choice, but so is courage. Love is stronger than hatred, even when that hatred has had centuries to grow and fester, and sometimes the most frightening experiences in our lives can become the foundation for our greatest gifts to the world. If you or someone you know is dealing with genuine supernatural phenomena, remember that you're not powerless, you're not alone, and you're not doomed to be a victim. There are people like Sophie who dedicate their lives to helping others navigate these experiences safely and meaningfully. And if you're a child or teenager who's discovered that you can see, hear, or sense things that others cannot, remember that your sensitivity is not a curse. It's a bridge between worlds, and it's a gift that the universe has trusted you to use for healing and hope. The supernatural world is vast and complex, filled with lost souls seeking peace, confused spirits needing guidance, and yes, occasionally malevolent entities that must be contained or banished. But it's also filled with helpers, protectors, and healers who work tirelessly to maintain the balance between fear and hope, between darkness and light. Sophie taught me that some children are destined to become guardians of that balance. And sometimes, the most terrifying supernatural encounter is actually the beginning of the most important work a person will ever do.